There are only 3 STARS members left now. Captain Wesker, Jill, and myself.
Biohazard is the actual name of Resident Evil. Resident Evil, like we mentioned in the last video, it was actually the name and title of Biohazard the franchise because of the fact that Biohazard itself could not be trademarked and could not be included as the official name and title for all the European and American countries. So now, Biohazard is the actual name with the proper and fully original release versus the Resident Evil of PlayStation 1, as well as the PAL version of which. And as we looked in the last video itself, it showed Richard Akin in the front with a few spiders and the silhouettes of the zombies that we highlighted with the Resident Evil title in it. Now we are going to take a deep dive into Biohazard, their box art, and also the materials that are included with it. So let's just get into it. So as we noted in the previous video itself, when we looked at the actual eye of the CD and the disc, that was actually the main box art for what we're seeing for the Resident Evil, well, in this case, Biohazard version release of the game. As you can see in the front, it's just going to be the eyeball with a drop or two of blood with the strenuous pupil that is showing and appearing that it's looking into something completely horrifying and frightening. Biohazard with itself, a cross title and box art is shown with a black drop shadow instead of a white one. Capcom at the top right, and I'm sure the tagline of "You're dead scared, faced your fear" is probably highlighted and included there. What's interesting about Japanese releases for PlayStation though is that they also make note of the actual PlayStation icon, Capcom, the tagline, the main title, but also it has the category even survival horror in English, which is at the bottom. Like our PAL version, it actually had the embedded PlayStation on the side and, on all the different sides of it. The only thing that's missing is the embedded PlayStation on the side there, on the front. And then here's the back of it, which is a little bit more colorful, showing a little bit more area in the mountains, the sky, and the iconic raven or crows in the game that you encounter at the bottom. For some reason in the Japanese releases, at least for a lot of their titles, they like to show the raven as it's in the game, even though you only experience it once or twice, maybe even a few times. Obviously I can't read any of the other languages, but it looks like there's some ESRB information, compact disc, NTSC, PlayStation Capcom logo with the barcode, and 3 actual screenshots. The screenshots highlight the raven, the main character, and the dog that's down the hallway. Nothing really symbolizing or showing the zombie that was in the front of the other ones, or at least the silhouette of it. The material of this one is much better than I would say the American kind of releases. As you can see, it's very thin, very, very kind of fragile in the sense, and definitely not as compact. If we open the box itself, we see the insert. I'm sure this has got a lot of trademark information. And then the instruction guide, which has a very different front to it in comparison to the others. The disc itself is also very bland and just one color with Biohazard cross, but very, stylish in the sense that it's very reflective with the PlayStation Capcom logo. That's very much simplistic, but I really do like the construction of this because it just feels much more durable and that it can withstand much more of a, I guess you can say, hit and sustainability across time when it comes to the PlayStation 1 version. Now, if we look at the instruction guide, I noticed a lot of similarities, but also a number of differences. So if we go ahead and open up the long box version of the guide that we went through, we can look and see some comparisons. First of all, the front and the back of it is very colorful and very illustrative. But in this particular one, the long box version shows the front art and, of Richard Atkin, of course, the zombie in the front. But in this one, in the Japanese version and release, it actually shows the laboratory, which we only seen in the one insert for the long box. It's very much not shown in any other parts of the other releases for Resident Evil. And then if we look on the back, it looks like it's got some more information about Biohazard, about how to contact them and such. But if you also look, behind those to try to see kind of what the image is without the actual notice, without the notices, it looks like it's a little bit more of the laboratory that we haven't seen before. The contents and the illustrations are much more apparent of the instruction guide, which, it even shows the insert of the destroyed room that we saw in the other inserts of all the other releases. But Biohazard, the contents, gives it a little bit more of a survival horror, cliche feel. Kind of like those classic monster movies that you would experience at a drive-in. But as you can see, as you go through this, even highlighting the prologue for Stars and for Resident Evil or Biohazard, it even shows a little bit of the prologue with the downed helicopter, which is going to be from the Alpha team. Highlights the dead or alive, as well as the game over and different status conditions for your character in the particular game. We did have this highlighted in the instruction guide for the long book as well on this particular status screen, which is showing here. And also it highlights a little bit more about the EKG, but in this regard, it's a lot more colorful, a little bit more straightforward. This, of course, highlights Chris Redfield as the main protagonist for the game that you actually play, and does highlight others such as Jill Valentine, which is really nice because it not only shows the in-game look of what the character looks like, but also has the anime look on the left side. I believe this is what the early concepts look like, as well as kind of the black and white versions that were in the previous instruction manual. And then if Jill Valentine is shown here, it looks like it's a different type of illustration that's shown as she's in a different pose, but it also shows her in-game character as well with her skills that are being highlighted here. It does highlight also a little bit more of the Stars team. It looks like it's in a more general sense. What's really cool is it actually has the anime version of what it looks like of the entire team, Alpha and Bravo team, actually together, and probably highlights each one in particular, which again, I can't read this other language, so I'm not even going to attempt to. I'm just going to try to surmise from what I'm seeing, with the images and references. This is also showing probably the tank controls, which are very early in the first instruction manual we were looking at. This is kind of in the middle, which is showing Chris Redfield in action and different controls in order to move them appropriately. This also shows and highlights the different game modes, which is only new game, load game, and option on the main title screen, which doesn't really show a whole lot on the previous one, as you can see here. Just starting a mission is probably the one that's the most comparison of the two. And as we continue to move forward, it looks like it highlights some key information on some other controls that are being performed, shooting up, shooting down, ahead, and the different manual controls. This also looks like it is showing how to actually move the different objects, all the different fixed camera angles and running, as well as the item box and also all of the weapons that are included with this. As we move forward, it shows a little bit more of the status screen and what it shows here. A little bit more about the items, where to examine them and where to actually use them. And then also the map file, radio, and exit buttons, which radio has been highlighted in the previous one as well. And, also the typewriters, which I'm sure they're highlighting the ink ribbons. This is probably highlighting more of the different herbs and medicinal objects in order to keep yourself alive during this horror and this particular game experience, as well as more images of Jill Valentine. This is really interesting because in the previous instructions, at least for the American release, it never highlighted the enemies, at least in the way that it looks. Here it actually highlights the snakes, the dog, and also the hunter, which, believe it or not, the hunter was never revealed in any of the previous instructions that we were seeing there. So it's interesting to see this in that regard being referenced there. I believe this page over here is highlighting different ways of aiming, shooting, and getting away from the actual zombies itself, and probably some good survival tips on how to ensure your survival through this. And then we have another image of Chris Redfield, which is really cool. I love all the illustrations in these instruction manuals for this. And then, of course, highlighting the ink ribbons and probably how important they are. This is equivalent to the weapons selection and description screen, which highlights the knife, the gun, and the shotgun, which is highlighted in the previous ones as well. Had a slight black and white image, but it was definitely very, very summarized, just like it probably is here. The other thing that's really cool, which you don't see a lot of in at least American games and American releases, is the same theme songs for the actual game. Theme songs for the game. Theme songs are actually something I always enjoy. That's one of the interesting things about Biohazard, and I enjoy the music very much. And I love the fact that, at least in the Biohazard release of this, which is the original release of it, that it highlights these theme songs. And that's kind of it as far as that goes for the original version. The interesting part is that this is the only kind that I could find basically for Japanese release of Biohazard in its original form. I mean, like I mentioned before, we do have the long box version of the American release for this, but there's no such thing as a long box version of Biohazard in itself and other releases that I can actually gauge. Same thing with the original releases for Resident Evil in the smaller format, as well as the PAL release as the only other formats I've seen, as well as the PC. Now, the PC does have another version of this in the big box version, is what they call it, and that includes basically the a big, massive box that you see in a lot of those older PC games that actually has the disc instructions in a much bigger, kind of more of a book-looking box. The last version that we're going to showcase and highlight in this particular video is going to be the Sega Saturn version. Unfortunately, I was unable to actually obtain a Sega Saturn American version, but I'll highlight what it looks like on the screen. With the Japanese release of Sega Saturn version is actually very similar to just the original release itself. The difference here is that it doesn't have the glorified eye that you're used to seeing, but it does have the Sega Saturn logo and the same type of survival horror Capcom and, back Black Shadow. What's interesting though is also the Sega Saturn version is much smaller, as you can compare, and it definitely doesn't have that intense feel. The back of this, though, is slightly different, as it kind of has a more kind of mansion encased feel, as it shows the hallway and basically the one of the doors that you go through on the second floor with the sconces of light there. And then in addition to that, it's got two small screenshots and one big one, and with the Sega Saturn Sega kind of logo with it instead of Capcom. This on the CD actually has some differences, a little bit more to it, where it's black and white with the shiny Sega Saturn icon on the bottom. The instruction manual for this one as well is also a little bit different, as it has a lot more information in the background where it actually shows the images of the game as you're going through it. Dead or Alive, game over kind of status screens that we've seen in there. with Chris and Jill Redfield in their anime form, with it looks like probably more description of who they are, what they're a part of, and what their quirks are, as well as pros and cons. The Alpha Team and Bravo Team are actually a lot more apparent versus like the slight transparent versions of them in the previous instructions we were seeing before. New game, load game options are also shown in these instructions, highlighting the different game modes. More highlights on the moves and special actions that can be performed with the use of the boxes and status screens. And then the fireplace, the equipment screen where you can actually perform different functions and examinations and usage. The map, file, radio, and exit buttons are also highlighted in this one. At the end, it also highlights Biohazard with Terror, Still Dawn, which are the two theme songs that they also highlighted in the previous instruction manual as well. So the Sega Saturn version is actually very similar, it's just a little bit more illustrated and has a little bit more information, but not by much. It's actually still very similar to the previous one. Well, thank you so much for joining and looking at the differences here with the original Resident Evil or Biohazard releases. Now, this was just the start, as this was the original game. The next one we're going to move on to is going to be the DualShock and Director's Cut versions that we're going to review, as it should be very interesting as there's even more differences in both. Not just in box art and instructions, but also in gameplay, which we're going to highlight next. But again, if you're a fan of this content, go ahead and throw me a like and let me know in the comments what you want to discuss with this, to see if there's even more secrets and things we can find as we go through the box art and instruction manuals for these. I myself am enjoying kind of this analysis, as it kind of opens my eyes to the times of when they were releasing this. I did go through it as a kid, but I didn't actually realize it as, kind of more like an adult as I am now. But yeah, if there's any secrets or any other things that you wanted to point out that maybe I didn't catch, let me know in the comments. Feel free to subscribe, as I'm going to have future videos showcasing a lot of these more, and we'll get right to it. Thanks so much. Catch you next time.